talk is about geology and the Battle of Antietam. I do want to let you know that in the hour that we have, there's no time to discuss all kinds of technicalities about the battle and how good the generals were and how the troops moved around. I have a lot of geology to present, and I think by the end you'll see that the geology did have an effect on the battle. Actually, almost all battles, at least let's say before relatively recent time, were very much influenced by topography, which of course is an aspect of geology. But relatively rarely does the actual bedrock underneath the battlefield play much or have much of an effect. However, there were several battles in the American Civil War in which the nature of the bedrock actually was important and perhaps determined outcomes to some degree, Gettysburg being the prime example of that. Antietam shows the same thing, although not quite as much. Again, the topography, the geomorphology, the shape of the landscape for any of these battles is of utmost importance, but the actual bedrock underneath, perhaps not quite so much. The first slide here, we want to set the stage for this. The invasion of Maryland in 1862 was Lee's first invasion. During the course of the war, he struck northward into Maryland and Pennsylvania, or towards Pennsylvania twice. This first invasion, he came across actually into Montgomery County, and at White's Ferry and White Ford and this other ferry, gathered his troops in Frederick. And then when he realized that the Union Army was mobilizing against him, he moved his troops through the passes of South Mountain and Catoctin Mountain, and he incidentally captured Harper's Ferry to protect his southern the southern approaches here. Eventually, the Union forces were too threatening for him to proceed to invade up into Pennsylvania, which was his original intention. So he gathered all his troops back. He was reluctant, Lee was reluctant to leave Maryland without some sort of a battle with the Union forces. So he gathered them at a place called Sharpsburg. And my little hand pointer there is roughly the spot where Sharpsburg is. It was, I'm sorry, it's up here. Sharpsburg was still in Maryland, but it was on the road over to the escape route, the ford that was near Shepherdstown in what's now West Virginia. So Lee gathered his forces here. The Union forces came over the mountains and gathered over to the east of him. So the battle was fought in the vicinity of Sharpsburg. This particular battle is called the Antietam, after the creek that flows nearby and figures in the battle. Now, if we look at the geology or the geologic setting, the geomorphic provinces, the Sharpsburg is shown here with this red diamond. The location of the town and its vicinity is in the Great Valley, the Appalachian Great Valley, which in Maryland is called the Hagerstown Valley. It's called the Shenandoah Valley when you go farther south into Virginia. The rocks in this area are relatively soft. They're carbonates many times. They're fairly easily eroded. Fairly close by to the east are harder rocks in the Blue Ridge province. So that's shown here. The Blue Ridge province in this particular vicinity has multiple ridges. In Virginia, we're kind of used to more or less a single fat kind of ridge going southward from this general area. But in Maryland, there's a set of ridges, the westernmost one of which is called Elk Ridge, which is right here. And that's clearly visible from the battlefield, as we'll see when we see some pictures. So the Piedmont is the province over here in which Frederick is situated, and shaded that sort of brown color there. So we have the Piedmont, we have the Blue Ridge, we have the ridge and valley, and specifically the Great Valley here to the west. And we're sitting in the Great Valley, very close to the western side of the Blue Ridge province. Now, in order to understand this battle, we have to go back a long time to fully understand it. And so we will go back about 500 million years. These are paleogeographic maps that show the general location of the continents at various times of the geologic past. Now, you can't take the maps too literally, but they do give you a fairly good idea of where things were at these various times in the geologic past. Another thing that they are good at showing is many times in the past, the deep history of Earth, the oceans covered much more of the continental areas than they do now. We have our continental shelf off of the eastern United States. Well, there's an immense continental shelf, as you can see, around a rather reduced North American, future North America at 520 million years ago, the Middle Cambrian. Now, this specific continental shelf, there is a little outline map of the US and Canada here, so you can get an idea of where things were. Maryland, of course, would be right about in here somewhere. And the general situation for the whole region here, for the whole future mid-Atlantic region, was a continental shelf carbonate bank. Now, we have a continental shelf today in which non-limestone type materials accumulate, what we call siliceous materials containing silicate minerals. The sand, the silt, mud, whatever that's accumulating out there is basically siliceous. Okay. Now, in present day Yucatan, if you go out into the Gulf, north and west from the Yucatan Peninsula, there's an immense continental shelf that is not covered with silicate material. It's covered with various layers of limestone. Some of it is coral type material, some of it is accumulated shell material, some of it precipitated out of the ocean water there, but that's what we call a carbonate bank. It's basically a huge flat area, somewhat submerged by the ocean, in which layers of carbonate minerals accumulate over time. And as rocks, these would become limestones and sometimes dolomite. So 520 million years ago, the general area that would become the state of Maryland and so forth was a continental shelf / carbonate bank. It started out being the more or less standard continental shelf, and gradually, as the shelf subsided over long periods of time, and the climate became warmer, a carbonate bank developed there. Now, if we move to this middle map, the basic situation isn't too different, except that Gondwana, down here to the south, is maybe slightly closer, a line of volcanic arcs marking a subduction zone has developed out in what geologists call the Iapetus Ocean, a predecessor basin to the Atlantic Ocean's basin. And this line of volcanic islands is eventually going to collide. It's going to be pulled up over the carbonate bank along the edge of Proto-North America. As we go through time then to about 250 million years ago, the Iapetus Ocean, the volcanic arc, all of this will all be squashed together as Gondwana in the form of future Northwest Africa collides with future Southeastern North America, okay, and South America and Europe, right, to form the continent of the supercontinent of Pangaea. The huge mountain range existed in our area. Now, the continental shelf / carbonate bank that was overridden by the collisions that eventually produced the supercontinent of Pangaea, some of that was destroyed in the fireworks here, the tectonic fireworks, but a good deal of it actually continues to exist. It was buried down underneath this giant mountain range here. So what I have here is a stratigraphic chart showing all the rock units that accumulated in our general area here. It's actually oriented a little bit to the west of us, but it's certainly good enough, covers the Sharpsburg area. And what we see here is there was an old continent, which geologists call the Grenvillian continent, and that was what we started with back there in the previous slide in the Cambrian. There was huge basaltic flows, okay, that produced the Catoctin flood basalts that covered over that Grenville rock. Then we have an era of the continental shelf. And in our general area, there's 3 formations that are involved with that: the Weaverton, the Harpers, the Antietam. Now, the Weaverton formation is what makes the white, it's the white rock of the Bull Run Mountains, of the Catoctin Mountains, just to the west of us. The Harpers is the more shale-like phalitic kind of rock that forms the water gap, much of the water gap at Harper's Ferry. The Antietam is a metamorphosed sandstone that is typically found to either to the east or the west of the Blue Ridge for a reason we'll see here in a minute. But Elk Ridge, which overlooks more or less the battlefield at Antietam, is made of this Antietam formation. Now, the name Antietam is a little confusing. The creek does not flow over the Antietam formation. The town of Antietam at the Potomac River, it doesn't occur there. It was named that because of it was first studied in the Antietam Creek Valley. Okay, now this set of stuff here represents the rifting and ocean growth that we saw there at the first slide, the Cambrian period in the preceding page. The beginning of the carbonate bank is marked here with Shady, Rome, Elbrook, Conococheague. Okay, gradually the carbonate bank subsided, and you got more and more pure forms of limestone deposited there. Now, the thing is, the battlefield is underlain by 3 of these. The Waynesboro is what it's called locally. The Elbrook, the Conococheague formations are the formations of of the rock that lies underneath the battlefield. Shady is called Thomastown in Maryland. It's called Shady in Virginia, which is where the diagram comes from. What we have is almost like a layer cake of materials that are then going to get involved in the collision that will eventually produce Pangea. So I have some cross sections here through the Alleghenian Mountains, which would have been that giant mountain range shown on the the rightmost map of the previous slide. And then this is actually a cross section of the present rock situation. So I'll explain these two diagrams here. The collisions that closed that proto-Atlantic Ocean, there were three principal ones. The one that's really shown here, well, actually all three of them are shown here. The biggest one, the final one, was the Alleghenian. Okay, there was an Acadian orogeny, that is a tectonic collision, and a tectonic collision. Now, the tectonic was the first one, and this material here is the carbonate bank, basically. Okay. What happened was the tectonic overrode the edge of the tectonic or of the carbonate bank. Then the Acadian overrode the tectonic, and then finally the Alleghenian mountains, that is what would become Northwest Africa, rode over everything else. But in the meantime, during this Alleghenian collision, a chunk of the ancient continent, the Grenvillian continent, from down underneath all this other stuff, broke off and slid to the west along with all this other stuff. So what I want you to see here is particularly the Blue Ridge covering over part of the carbonate bank. And then farther to the west, other things are deposited on top, which we're not going to get really get into for our talk tonight. Now, this is a diagram of a cross section taken about 100 miles south of Sharpsburg, but the main points of it still are true at Sharpsburg. Basically, our carbonate bank is this yellow material. Now, all these collisions broke slabs of it off that rode over each other. Okay, the Grenvillian continent material that I said broke off is represented by this slab, of which there's a arced portion right here, which is the Blue Ridge. So the movement of material, the slab of material that goes above ground, okay, that we see as the Blue Ridge, actually has deep roots underground farther to the east under the Piedmont and the coastal plain. And then the carbonate bank is underneath all that, okay? Now, in addition, other materials then were pushed on top of the Grenvillian material, material related to the tectonic and the Acadian collisions, okay? Now, one of the things that's kind of interesting is that that this sequence, or let me put it this way, the Grenvillian material with the carbonate bank on top of it, which is, this actually should be shown as Grenvillian right here, okay, with the two Acadian and tectonic collisions on top of that, okay, that whole pile of stuff was once in place where we now have the Blue Ridge. So there was a period of time in which Piedmont type rock was eroding off of the Blue Ridge, okay? Then the Grenvillian type rock, which is the present Grenvillian stuff, and the carbonate material also was once on top of that pile. And so over time, the debris that wore off of the future Blue Ridge changed. Now, when we try to put all this together with the present situation across Maryland, okay, this is an older cross section that you can get off the web for Maryland from 1968. But the parts of it under the Piedmont actually are a bit out of date, but much of the rest of this is still pretty good. What we see here, with a little bit of help, okay, the Blue Ridge rock, the Blue Ridge Massif, okay, is this here, and it's actually a gigantic arched structure that's turned over towards the west. Okay, so it's what's called an inclined anticline. I can't remember the correct term for this, but anyway, it's overturned. That's the word I wanted. It's an overturned anticline that's overturned towards the west. And then the materials that are in the Great Valley is a syncline, okay, that was formed at the same time as the anticline pushed against the carbonate bank and squashed it into a giant syncline. One thing that's very noticeable here in this diagram is that there are folds upon folds, as I have in my title up there. As you go down underneath the surface, you will find a whole series of gigantic folds of much less scale than the biggest fold, which is this, okay? And this goes right down to practically to the microscopic level. This is a syncline. A syncline is a U-shaped fold. When you start with a pile of materials, such as we're starting with, the youngest material will be in the middle. And that's what this is here. It's the Martinsburg Formation. It's the youngest material that's exposed in the Great Valley. And then as you go to either side, the materials get older. So up here, we have the Antietam Formation, the Thomastown Formation, that is, it had a different name on that other slide, the Waynesboro, the Elbrook, the Conococheague, all the formations that I was talking about are represented here, okay? So if we now go to the battlefield area itself, okay, what we find here is the Conococheague is this very light colored material. And also this brownish area here, which is a slightly different texture than the rest of it. So that's why it's shown separately here. Okay, this sort of brownish red area is the Elbrook Formation. And then these two layers along the side here are the Waynesboro Formation. The Thomastown is hardly in our picture. It's off to the side over there. So Sharpsburg is right here. The biggest part of the battle area, okay, was basically kind of this right here, right? So the bulk of it is Conococheague, okay, which is both of these two colors, with Elbrook kind of wrapping around that. And then in the valley of the Antietam Creek, in its more southern area here, which figured in the battle, we have the Waynesboro Formation, okay? Now, the reason that we're going into all this is because these different formations actually did have an effect on how the battle played out. And that is what we will start talking about. A main effect of them is that the general landscape that's underlain by the Conococheague. And you can see that same arch here on this map, which is another map from the Maryland Geologic Survey. They call it Charlestown District, broad, open, gently rolling karstic. That means the limestone and dolomite dissolve into certain features like sinkholes and so forth. Plain, underlain by limestones and dolomites. Pinnacle karst and sinkholes are fairly common. I'm going to show you what pinnacles and what sinkholes look like. They are the main karst features along with subterranean drainage. Okay, limestone outcrops common to abundant. What that means is that in the fields, in the cleared fields, and then of course so in the woods before the fields are cleared, you will see the limestone rock sticking up. The soils generally are quite thin, or often quite thin. That's what's being referred to here with the residuum of variable thickness. Residuum means that the non-carbonate portion of the original bedrock, that is the silt, the sand, the muddy stuff that was mixed in with the lime, okay, that material is just sitting there with the carbonate dissolved into the groundwater, and that will form the soil. In some places that means a very, very thin soil, and other places it can be thicker. Now, this basically is the Conococheague Formation, and remember Sharpsburg is right about here. The rest of the area that's involved with the battlefield is basically in here. Okay, the rest of the area involved with the battlefield is what the Maryland Geologic Survey calls Waynesboro District, dissected rolling plain with north-northeast oriented ridges due to relatively resistant beds within the Elbrook, the Tomstown, and the major portion of the Waynesboro Formation. Okay, thick colluvial cover next to South Mountain. What that means is that the side of the mountain has been shedding downward onto this plain. So here, if you look at the relief that's indicated with the shadowing, you'll see that large portions of this Charlestown district, that is the Conococheague Formation area, are relatively flat. There's relatively little relief, okay? Whereas the relief, that is the hilliness, is considerably more obvious over here in what they call the Waynesboro District, where the Elbrook and the Waynesboro formations are. Now, when we're at the battlefield, finally we've gotten to the battlefield itself here. When you're at the battlefield, you can actually see these two different types of terrain. There's a 14th Connecticut Infantry Monument that's near the Bloody Lane, which is this thing here. If you look basically to the west-northwest, the visitor center is right there. The area is pretty flat. I mean, it's obviously arched to some degree or curving in some degree, but it's pretty flat. Whereas if you turn around and look the other direction, it's obviously much more hilly. And this is the observation tower, and this is the Bloody Lane right there. The Elk Ridge that I talked about is this elevation on the horizon. If we take a cross section through Sharpsburg, okay, the Potomac River is right here. Sharpsburg would be right about here, okay. You have a little bit of hilliness, but a nice little upland area right here at Sharpsburg. And then you get the rolling countries shown over here, okay, and that's Antietam Creek. The Waynesboro makes small hills, and you can see that right there. And then you go up to the height of the Elk Ridge, which is visible here in the photograph. So now I promised to tell you about sinkholes and pinnacles. The pinnacles, basically when limestones erode and they're tilted, okay, to get this effect, you need to be tilted, okay. The variable hardness, the variable resistance to erosional removal of the various layers within the limestone make for these projections, often in a sort of linear fashion, like little small scale mountain ranges practically, okay, where the bedrock is just literally sticking up through the soil. This kind of thing, this is just called pinnacle karst, that you end up with these points. If you could remove all the soil from this picture, you would probably be amazed at what would be visible. There would be towers and pits and caves and all kinds of stuff that's hidden down underneath the soil usually, but the highest stuff sticks up as these pinnacles, and you'll see these as almost like ribs running through the fields and the woods of the Sharpsburg area. And particularly, again, the Conococheague formation. Another thing that's common in the Conococheague is sinkholes. Sinkholes form almost overnight sometimes, or maybe perhaps up to a few weeks. As soon as they form, they're a low spot and materials wash into them, and very gradually clay-like material, silty material clogs the drainage up so that it partially fills in with what's almost insoluble, not insoluble, it is insoluble, but materials that block the drainage. Sometimes these kind of things become lakes, for instance. But in any case, the original hole down into some sort of a cavern underneath gets cut off by the accumulation of silty, muddy, clay-rich debris. And very often, when this kind of a sinkhole is in the middle of the field, as this one is, the farmer can't do too much with it, and you end up with little mini gardens of trees and shrubs growing in them. Now, if we look over here at the air photo, this is a satellite view of the Miller Farm, which is the site of the infamous cornfield and the Eastwoods. You can actually see the sinkholes, the former sinkholes, and you can see evidence for the pinnacles that I was talking about at various places. In many battlefields, there are areas where the sinkholes are really common, or the limestone outcrops like these pinnacles that we're talking about are so thick that the farmer can't clear the territory at all, which means it will be left as a woods. So at the time of the Civil War, in other battles where there were wooded areas versus open cleared areas, often the woods had an extraordinarily messy kind of topography, which may have helped or hindered the troops. In the case of Antietam, the woods that existed seem, as far as I can tell, to be mostly just places where the farmer just decided to leave woods for their purposes. They needed wood for construction. They needed wood for heat in their houses and so forth. So the woods don't mark particularly nasty places as far as the karst topography goes. But other battlefields, that's not the case. So now we want to talk about the specific formations, since we are, this is a geologic talk, so we We need to look at the formations. We need to look at the rock. Okay, we're going to start with the youngest, which is the Conococheague, the youngest geologically. Okay, the depositional environment was tidal to shallow marine on a carbonate platform. So something like walking into the ocean at a resort along the Gulf of Mexico from Yucatan, you would walk across and then down into water that would be the kind of environment in which this Conococheague formed. The limestones are dark blue and they're laminated. The dark blue color is for limestone is a good indicator of relative purity. And the laminations often represent specific events, specific storms that might have occurred. In many cases, there's a very thin layer of siliceous material separating these laminations. The laminations are mostly limestone, but a very thin little layer of silica, and that it probably indicates that a storm passed through and laid down that little bit of muddy stuff. The little thin layers are referred to as siliceous partings. The parting is a crack on which the rock would preferentially break. Okay, this particularly pure carbonate rock dissolves into the open terrain with relatively little relief that we were talking about. There's no reason why it should erode in any preferred way, that any part of it is more susceptible to erosion than another. So you tend to end up with a relatively flat, plateau kind of a terrain, except where bigger streams have been able to cut down into it. There's a picture here of a flat weathered surface, which is fairly common on the Conococheague. The drainage is almost completely subterranean. If you look around the area of Sharpsburg, you will find almost no streams running in the Conococheague limestone area because the drainage is under the ground. Because of that, then you don't have stream valleys, you don't have the swales or anything much at all to disturb the general flatness. Now, as far as offense or defense for the type of army that we had and the type of weapons that they had during the American Civil War, if there's no woods, there's no place to hide. Neither the offense nor the defense has any place to hide their actions or take cover. Sometimes those pinnacle outcrops were big enough for small groups of people to hide behind, and combined with woods, a few movements were done that were a surprise when the people popped out, but generally the Conococheague doesn't give you much cover. Now, the Elbrook limestone is fairly different. Okay, now it's an older one. Remember that we progressed from a sandy, silty kind of continental shelf to a carbonate platform during the course of our geologic story we told earlier. The Elbrook actually represents a transitional period in that. So it's not a pure limestone. Okay, it's light blue in color, which right away is an indicator that it's not going to be terribly pure. It's laminated against individual storms, probably represent a lot of these layers that you see. Argillaceous means clay rich. Okay, that's the kind of limestone that's there. And then even more siliceous, okay, more uncarbonate, we have calcareous shale. So we actually have mud that had limey stuff mixed in it that became shale rock. And a little bit of
Joe?
Yeah.
Sorry, before we go a little too far away from it, we have a question. Is it Boteler's Ford underlain by sandstone. Botelier's, Boteler, Ford.
Okay, that is down near Shepherdstown, and it is actually the Waynesboro. No, I'm sorry. Let me go back. Yeah, the Conococheague. Yes, it's down here, and it's the Conococheague limestone is at the site of that fort. Now, just because the Conococheague is generally relatively pure and generally makes a relatively flat landscape, that doesn't mean, particularly when you have a major river like the Potomac cutting through it, that the river can't develop, the erosion can't develop according to this northeast fabric of the layers of limestone. And that's what happened at the ford down near Shepherdstown. Okay?
Thank you very much. That's all now.
Okay. Okay, the Elbrook weathers very well. It weathers rapidly compared to the Conococheague. It breaks into shaly pieces. We'll see in a picture in a minute a little bit what we're talking about there. And it just tends to break into small pieces and leave very few natural outcrops. Because it weathers relatively rapidly compared to the Conococheague, okay, it actually makes a lower surface in the battlefield area, which figured in the battle because of the difference of elevation. And within the Elbrook, the silicious rich material, ironically enough, actually erodes faster than the pure limestone. Now, this may seem a little opposite to what you would expect. Everything else being equal, if you have limestone various a silica-rich rock, okay, particularly if the particles are large, as with sand and sandstone and so forth, then the silicious material is going to erode more slowly. But in this case, we have extremely small silica particles, and they have the effect of weakening the structure they're in, the laminae, okay? And so consequently, the silica-rich material weathers faster than the pure limestone. So we end up with swales and valleys between carbonate rises, between higher areas of carbonate. And that explains the topography of the more southern part of the battlefield area, how hilly it is, as we saw in the picture before. The hilly landscape has a different effect for offense and defense. It breaks lines of sight. So this helps and hinders both the offense and the defense. If you can't see as far, okay, then you can't shoot as far. The people on the offense can get up closer. People in the defense can be completely hidden. So the concealment factor here is very important. I have a picture here. This is actually a view off of the observation tower showing the general hilliness that we're talking about here with swales and deep valleys. Unfortunately, the photographs don't show this really clearly, as when you ride around the battlefield, there's some places where you look in this part of the battlefield and the hills are amazingly steep. And that's always in the Elbrook portion of the battlefield. So here's some pictures with the Elk Brook. Near Antietam Creek, there's a nice exposure of it. The cliffs that occur on the western side of the creek, and we'll talk about the battles that were fought in that particular area pretty soon, are made from the Elk Brook. This picture here, if you look, you see there's cross fracturing, and this is that shaly weathering that we were talking about. The rock just breaks into little pieces as it erodes. And incidentally, stromatolites, which some people would find interesting, are common in the Elk Brook, although much farther south. Okay, the Waynesboro Formation, which is our third formation, it's the oldest, so the continental shelf type aspect is the most pronounced here. Red, gray, yellowish brown, thin bedded siltstone or shale, and actually even some sandstone. And then there's actually two parts, the other part being more shaly. Okay, the rock weathers at a similar rate to the Elk Brook. So the general surface is about the same elevation in the battlefield area, but it has near the creek produced a line of hills. So the Philip Pry House, which is the Union headquarters during the battle, is sitting on one of those hills. And this is a view. At the time that the war was fought, there would be very few trees. There would be woodlots, but really not anything like a forest like this. It's a little hard to see in this picture, but the observation tower in the battlefield is somewhere around there, I think. So this is where the Union command could actually look over the battlefield and see much of what was going on. And then this is a picture of the interbedded sandstone and carbonate of the Waynesboro. So the battle itself is conveniently divided into three phases. September 17th, 1862. It started in the north, moved toward the middle, and then ended up in the south of the battlefield area. There was activity in all the areas to some degree all the time, but the main action very definitely started there, shifted to here, then shifted to there. And as you can see, we're shifting across these various formations that we've been talking about. So up in the north, the famous cornfield, which is pictured in this photograph here, is on the Conococheague. Now and then, it was wide open and flat. The woods would have been situated a little bit differently in those days from the maps that I've been able to find, and probably a bit sparser than what we have today. But there were woods that shielded you from being literally out in the open like this. But much of the battle was fought literally trying to capture this flat land. The one side would march out, get slaughtered by the other side would march out, get slaughtered by the first side, and back and forth and back and forth. So you can say that the bedrock here had a very definite role to play in how the battle worked out. The sunken road, the famous sunken road, it's right near the border between the Conococheague and the Elk Brook. It's actually in the more hilly area. The Conococheague is up at the top up here, the more flat. That memorial that I showed you a picture from earlier is over here someplace. This is a picture of a sunken road from that same time period. The road at Sharpsburg was apparently a farmer's road that was used as a kind of a shortcut so that they could take the heavily laden wagons with grain to grind down to the river where the grinding took place without going through the town itself. But the heavy wagons and the horses' hoofs and whatever had dug away at the material at the surface and created what's called a sunken road. If you look at this picture of the modern road, of the modern Bloody Lane from the observation tower, it's not very deep, but it was deep enough for men to hide behind. And it was like a nature-made trench for the kind of warfare they fought then. So it was very good from that point of view. The Confederates could have held out there kind of indefinitely. When the Union tried to come down on them, they had to stand up at the tops of these kinds of hills that over here that overlooked this natural trench, and they just got mowed down over on this side. Eventually, however, the southern troops had a bit of a confusion, and they weren't looking at the right place at the right time. And coming, I think, from over this way, Union troops got in place, standing up at the top of a hill like that, and just simply shot down through the length of the of what now is called Bloody Lane to great effect. And so they carried the day there. And finally, the third area, the southernmost area of the battle, is what's now called Burnside Bridge. It was called Lower Bridge or Warback Bridge in those days. It's an interesting area. The creek flows through here. The Confederates were up high here on the Elbrook Formation, which is that hilly kind of landscape. The creek has cut down, made cliffs, which continue for some distance downstream. The other side is Waynesboro, and in the past, the creek had dug away over here to make a wide flat area. And then there's one of the hills that I told you about that's very typical of the Waynesboro. The Union had to come down off of their hill, cross the flat area here, cross the bridge, all the time being surveyed by the Confederates up on this hill over here and scattered around in all these trees. So there was a great slaughter that occurred here at the Warback Bridge, as you can imagine. One thing that would have been better, possibly to do, would have been to have gone downstream and crossed up the Snavely's Ford. But for various different reasons, the Union forces didn't do that except for one portion of their forces. Again, much of the bank on both sides was steep. The Elbrook on the one side, the Waynesboro on the other, but there were places that could be crossed as shown here at Snavely's Ford. Okay, so that's my presentation. Let me turn things off here. Here I am again. So now we're ready for questions.
Thank you so much, Joe. I would like to remind the audience that this would be a great opportunity to either ask your questions using your voice or ask them through the chat. And Craig would like to share that rebels at Burnside Bridge were in an abandoned quarry, a natural trench.
So did you collect questions, Cernella?
I asked you the one question that came through the chat. So if anybody has any other questions other than that, it is a great opportunity to ask them now.
The what you've talked about is basically how the underlying rock affected the various and sundry war parts of this war. But I guess my question is what is the effect on the vegetation that was there? Was there different vegetation that could possibly grow on different parts just because of the what was in the rock?
Well, that's a good question. One of the reasons that the farming was so widespread in that area, and still is, in fact, is the natural fertility of soils that are rich with carbonate. So that actually now that's not exactly natural vegetation, but it is a kind of vegetative effect. There would be some minor difference in the plants because of the bedrock. So carbonate rich ones would tend, for instance, to have the eastern red cedar, where the material that was purely siliceous probably wouldn't. But I don't think that there's a big effect on the natural vegetation because of the formations we were talking about.
Okay.
Now, if you go up into the ridges of the Blue Ridge province a little bit farther to the east there, then yes, there would be a different
That's the type of question.
ecosystems there.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. We have another questions from the chat. Would you please comment on the caverns? I think it's just north of the Pry House.
There are caverns along the Potomac River. I guess that's what they're referring to, and others that are inland from that. You can assume that if you have a relatively pure limestone like the Conococheague, and even a less pure one like the Elbrook, that there are countless caverns and openings down underneath you. I did have a photograph of the Elbrook Formation where the I-68, I guess it is there, cuts through it, the freeway, and you can still see the holes that would have been below the ground before they dissected the landscape there. The ground, or the bedrock immediately underneath all the areas that are pictured in my presentation would be like Swiss cheese. The bigger ones that have external entrances that humans can get into, get the news, but they are just a tiny percentage of the total amount of caverns that exist in the subterranean area there.
Can I say something?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Hi, Joe. It's Roger.
Hi, Roger.
I enjoyed your presentation very much. It was very, very good. I noticed that you presented the battle really from the Union perspective, which is what most historians do. I mean, it's three separate battles from the Union perspective: morning, afternoon, midday, and afternoon, with different force compositions in each battle. But from the Confederate side, it's one continuous battle because Lee is continually shifting his forces to repel the incoming Union attacks. And I just wanted to point that out. I mean, it's the way you present the battle is the way most historians do. And I thought that was very good.
Okay. Yeah, I can make a comment there, and that is Lee's position, which of course he was free to choose, he's the one that determined where the battle was going to be, was on a relatively high flat portion of the Conococheague, with the Elbrook then to the east of him and the south, and it was a commanding position. He had he had a relatively small perimeter, from his one flank to the other, in which he had to move his troops around. So he basically didn't move. He just sat there pushing the troops where they needed to be. Okay. The Union side, of course, effectively had to deal with these differences of topography, because they had a much longer perimeter. They had the stream. Some of their troops were on one side, some were on the other, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I didn't mean to pick one side or the other, but
Oh no, I didn't mean to say that, Joe. I just wanted to point that out, because I think Lee picked this position because he thought it was a relatively good defensive position.
as it turned out to be.
Yeah.
Yes, I agree.
Although there are historians that argue he should not have fought this battle.
That Lee shouldn't have.
No, he shouldn't have,
Okay.
because at best he's outnumbered 2-1 by the Union forces. At best, he's going to come out with a draw. And I know he's a tremendously aggressive general. He didn't want to leave Maryland without a battle, but it cost him an awful lot in terms of casualties. He lost about half of his army.
Yeah. Okay. Well, these are extra geological considerations.
Yes,
so.
they are. I'm sorry, I can't help it. I wanted to talk to you about this when we took our tour.
Yeah, I do want to mention that Roger and Carolyn made a large contribution to ANS last year on the condition that I take them on a private tour, geologic tour, which we determined to be Antietam, and then a gift from the Far East, a viral gift from the Far East intervened, and we were not able to do the trip. So anyway, Roger was very interested in this battle, obviously.
Thank you so much for that. We have another question. Can you compare the geology of Gettysburg to Antietam?
All right, I'll try to do that really quick. Yes, you can compare, and it's a useful comparison. Gettysburg, there is an igneous rock there called diabase, and then a soft sedimentary type rock, usually more or less a shale, mudstone kind of thing. The high places at Gettysburg are the soft sedimentary rock. The hard rock makes for the upland regions, the Seminary Ridge, the Little Round Top, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And much more straightforwardly than the somewhat subtle influence of the different types of bedrock at Antietam, you can really see how the bedrock influenced that particular battle, that is Gettysburg. Okay?
Thank you.
We'll have to do a different talk on that one.
Absolutely. Where was the Dunker Church geologically?
The Dunker Church was in Conococheague.
Okay, I hope that answers that question.
It's right near the cornfield, and in fact, the historic picture I had there of the troops on the fighting near the cornfield, the Dunker Church was pictured in the background.
Fantastic. All right, Jan would like to thank you, Joe, for a most illuminating presentation.
Thank you.
Lynn would like to know, why would the pewter limestone be blue-gray? Isn't limestone made out of calcium carbonate?
That's a good question. I should be prepared for that, but I cannot tell you offhand exactly where that bluish color is coming from.
All right. Any presence of copper, which usually has some bluish and greener tint in it?
I really don't know. There's something in the rock imparting the color. The calcite, if pure, would basically be white.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Had the corn been harvested and the stalks down before September 17?
No, actually, quite famously, the field was not harvested, and there's pictures you can find on the web of the soldiers. Well, the corn was as higher than the soldiers. They're marching, fighting as much with the corn stalks as they are with the bullets flying around them. No, that the field was unharvested before the battle there, and supposedly there was almost nothing left of it, of the corn, after the fighting was done.
Wow. Were there any landscape-related reasons why McClellan failed to seize the initiative against Lee with his superior forces, or was it simply McClellan's ineptitude?
Well, again, I mean, this is well, okay. McClellan had a more difficult situation, as we mentioned before, because Lee had picked the site and had a fairly good defensive position overall. So from that point of view, as the attacker, McClellan had a more difficult situation. But the way the battle actually worked out, I think Roger will agree that most historians believe McClellan was simply too timid. He would not commit his troops. He didn't trust many of his generals. There was any number of reasons. He should have won that battle and utterly destroyed Lee's army, and he didn't.
Yes, Joe, I certainly agree with you. McClellan was a very cautious general, and that attitude pervaded the Army of the Potomac, his army. And he was a perfect foil for Lee. Lee is a very aggressive general, always taking chances. And it was very easy for Lee to overcome McClellan because McClellan was so cautious. And also, as you said, the offense, it's more difficult for the offense when you're fighting a battle like this to prevail. And also, McClellan had further fresh troops that he did not throw into the battle. He could have wiped out Lee's army, but he didn't. However, the battle is usually seen as a strategic Union victory. Lee retreats from Maryland back into Virginia. Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation because of this Union victory.
Thank you very much for that. Going back to the caverns, have you noticed the area east of the Burnside Bridge, probably off battlefield property known as Horseshoe Bend, north of the Antietam Creek? Would that be Waynesboro?
I'd have to look at the map. I think, no, I'd have to look at the map because I don't want to just speculate. Whoever asked the question, if you have a map that shows the Horseshoe Bend and a map, you can compare it to the map of the battlefield that I have in the slides. it should be, I'm pretty sure that it's Elbrook, but I don't know for positive fact.
All right.
Okay, wait, I'm a little confused here. The Horseshoe Bend, is that on the Potomac or in the Antietam?
Antietam.
Okay, because the Potomac has pronounced meanders to the west of the battlefield area, and that's completely in the Conococheague Formation. The Antietam tends to the north of the bridge to be mostly on the Elbrook Formation, and then some parts of it to the south are on the Waynesboro. So I'm pretty sure that the meanders north of the bridge would be Elbrook, but again, you could check the maps and just determine that.
Thank you so much, Joe. That would be all that we have in the chat box for now. Thanks everyone for being here with us. It has been a great pleasure to come back to the Naturalist Hour, and I hope to see you all tomorrow. Thank you, Joe, for an amazing illuminating presentation.
Thank you, Joe, as always. Very clear, very clear.